My name is Emilia, and I am 31 years old. 5 years ago, my mother called me the night before my bar exam, sobbing that my grandmother was dying. I abandoned 3 years of law school sacrifice, forfeited thousands of dollars in fees, and jumped on a red-eye flight to Washington. But when I burst through my grandmother's front door the next morning, she was standing in the kitchen baking cookies. She had no idea what I was talking about. My mother faked a medical emergency to force me to miss the biggest exam of my life, just so my sister could be the first lawyer in our family. Before I tell you how I made them pay for stealing my future, welcome to Hazel Tells Stories. Please take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to survive a toxic family. Also, drop where you are listening from in the comments below. I love reading them. Let me take you back to that night 5 years ago. I was sitting on the edge of a stiff mattress in a downtown Seattle hotel room. The clock on the nightstand read 11:45 p.m. In exactly 8 hours, I was supposed to walk into a convention center and take the uniform bar exam. My laptop screen cast a cold blue glow across a desk covered in color-coded sticky notes and practice tests. I was drowning in student debt. I had spent 3 years surviving on cheap coffee and 4 hours of sleep a night. Every dime I had earned working as a waitress went into prep courses and the non-refundable testing fees that secured my seat for the next morning. I was rubbing my eyes trying to memorize one last civil procedure rule when my phone buzzed. The screen showed my mother Linda calling. She rarely called me and never this late. I picked it up expecting a stiff generic good luck text. Instead, the line carried the sound of jagged, wet breathing. She was sobbing. "It is Grandma Evelyn," she choked out. Her voice cracked. "She had a stroke, Emilia. A bad one. The doctors do not think she will make it through the night. You need to come home right now." The air vanished from the room. My chest felt tight. Grandma Evelyn was not just a relative. She was the woman who secretly slipped me $20 bills when my parents refused to help with my college textbooks. She was the one who bought me my first LSAT prep book, while my father was busy funding my younger sister Britney and her lavish sorority lifestyle. Evelyn was the only person in the family who looked at me and saw someone worth fighting for. Logic ceased to exist in that moment. I did not think about the exam, the debt, or the years of grueling study. I grabbed my overnight bag and swept my toiletries off the bathroom counter, letting them tumble into the canvas. I left the expensive review books open on the desk. I ordered a rideshare to the airport while sprinting down the quiet hotel hallway, my shoes silent against the carpet. In the back of the cab, illuminated by the passing streetlights, I booked a $600 red-eye flight. It was charged to a credit card that was already teetering on its limit. The flight was a blur of turbulence and quiet panic. I sat pressed against the cold acrylic of the airplane window, watching the dark landscape roll beneath me. I prayed to whoever was listening, bargaining for just 10 more minutes. Just enough time to walk into that hospital room, hold her hand, and tell her I loved her before she slipped away. I had no idea I was flying directly into a trap. The aircraft hit the tarmac with a heavy jolt, rattling my bones and pulling me from a restless, disorienting fog. I had not slept a single minute since that devastating phone call. My entire system felt flooded with a toxic cocktail of adrenaline, dread, and stale airline coffee. When the seatbelt sign chimed, I practically shoved my way into the aisle, ignoring the irritated glares of the business travelers around me. I grabbed my overnight bag and hurried off the plane, my heart hammering against my ribs. The terminal at 5:30 in the morning was a ghost town. The squeak of my sneakers against the polished floors echoed through the empty concourse, but I did not stop walking. I kept my phone pressed tight against my ear, listening to the rhythmic ringing on the other end, desperate for any update on the woman who had essentially raised me. I dialed my father, Richard, first. Growing up, he was the family crisis manager, a man who handled the logistics of our lives with a detached corporate efficiency. If a car broke down or a financial issue arose, Richard made a single stern phone call and fixed the problem. He demanded order and obedience from everyone in his orbit. I desperately needed his composed voice to tell me which intensive care unit to go to, but the call went straight to voicemail. His recorded greeting was brisk and clipped. I hung up and immediately dialed my younger sister Britney. The line rang 4 times before her automated voice answered. Britney rarely answered my calls anyway. She was usually too busy curating her flawless life for social media or spending our father's credit cards on weekend trips she labeled as networking. But surely tonight of all nights she would have her device glued to her palm. Our grandmother was dying. We were supposed to be a family rallying around a hospital bed. The suffocating quiet from both of them felt heavy and wrong. I burst through the sliding glass doors of the terminal and stepped into the humid morning air. The sky above the city was the color of bruised iron. I jumped into the first available taxi and gave the driver the address for the county hospital, the largest trauma center in the area. I told him to step on the gas, offering him a $50 cash tip if he got me to the emergency room in under 20 minutes. He nodded, pulling away from the curb and taking the highway on-ramp with a squeal of tires. I spent the entire ride staring out the passenger window, watching the familiar flat landscape blur past. My chest ached with a sharp physical pressure. I was terrified that I was already too late to say goodbye. The hospital automatic doors parted and I ran into the emergency room. The air inside smelled like industrial bleach and stale sweat. A few people slumped in the rigid plastic waiting chairs, looking exhausted and gray under the harsh fluorescent lights. I sprinted straight to the triage desk, my canvas bag slipping off my shoulder. The nurse behind the thick plexiglass barrier looked up with kind, tired eyes. I planted my hands on the counter trying to catch my breath. I told her I needed the room number for Evelyn Afton and explained she had been brought in last night after a severe stroke. The nurse nodded, typing the name into her keyboard. The clacking of the plastic keys sounded like gunshots in the quiet room. I watched her screen, waiting for the room number to appear, but her brow furrowed. She backspaced and typed the last name again. "I am sorry," she said, looking up at me. "We do not have an Evelyn Afton admitted here." I blinked, the words failing to register in my brain. I shook my head, gripping the edge of the counter harder. I pleaded with her to check the intensive care unit. I told her my mother called me near midnight and said the stroke was fatal. The nurse checked another screen, her expression softening into that practiced clinical sympathy medical professionals use for grieving families. "I checked the entire hospital census," she replied gently. "There is no Evelyn Afton here." She asked if I was sure the ambulance brought her to this specific facility. A cold, sharp spike of panic drove straight through my ribs. I pulled my phone out and dialed my mother again, my hands shaking so badly I dropped the device onto the floor. I snatched it up and pressed call. It rang twice before Linda answered. "Mom," I shouted, standing in the middle of the emergency room. I told her the nurse said Grandma was not there and asked if she had been transferred. There was a long pause on the line. I strained to hear the background noise, expecting the beep of medical monitors or the murmur of doctors. Instead, I heard the faint sound of a television playing a morning talk show. "Oh, Emilia," my mother said. Her voice sounded strangely calm, flat, almost bored. She told me they had taken her back to her house and just to come there. I froze as the hospital noise faded into a dull ring in my ears. I repeated her words, they tasted wrong in my mouth. I asked how they could take a critical stroke victim home the next morning. I asked if she was on hospice or if she was comfortable. My mother just sighed, sounding irritated that I was even asking questions. She told me they were all there and to just get a cab. Then the line went dead. I stood in the emergency room, staring at the dark screen of my phone. Nothing about the situation aligned with reality. Hospitals do not discharge active stroke patients a few hours after admission. They do not send dying women home without a care team. I walked back out to the taxi stand, operating on pure mechanical instinct. I gave the driver the address for Grandma Evelyn's modest ranch house in the suburbs. The ride took 30 minutes, but those minutes stretched into an eternity. I leaned my head against the cool glass of the window, trying to prepare myself for what I was about to see. I pictured a rented hospital bed set up in the living room. I pictured IV poles and oxygen tanks. I braced myself for the smell of sickness and the sound of labored breathing. That house was the place where I had spent my summers hiding from my father's impossible expectations and my mother's constant criticism, while Richard and Linda molded Britney into their perfect prodigy. Evelyn let me read books on her porch and told me I was going to be a brilliant lawyer someday. She was my sanctuary, the only one who believed in my intellect. The cab pulled up to the curb. The neighborhood was quiet, bathed in the soft golden light of early morning. I stepped out into the damp grass, noting that the house looked exactly the same. The wooden porch swing still hung from its chains, and the flower beds were neatly weeded. There was no ambulance parked in the driveway. There were no cars belonging to hospice nurses or emergency personnel. Just my father's sleek silver sedan parked near the garage. I walked up the concrete path, my legs feeling heavy and unresponsive. Every step required a conscious command from my brain. I reached the front door and took one final deep breath, trying to fortify my heart for the worst goodbye of my life. I turned the brass knob and pushed the door open, stepping into the hallway. The world simply stopped making sense. I had braced for the sterile smell of rubbing alcohol and sickness. I expected hushed voices and the rhythmic beep of medical equipment. Instead, the warm, heavy scent of cinnamon sugar and melting butter hit my face. The house was bright with morning sunlight streaming through the sheer curtains in the living room. I heard the soft hum of the refrigerator and the clinking of metal against ceramic. I walked slowly toward the kitchen and my overnight bag slipped from my shoulder, hitting the floor with a dull thud. My grandmother was not lying in a rented hospital bed. She was standing at her kitchen island wearing her favorite yellow floral apron tied neatly around her waist. She held a metal spatula in one hand and was sliding perfectly round snickerdoodle cookies onto a wire cooling rack. She looked up when my bag hit the floor, her eyes widening behind her wire-rimmed glasses. "Emilia," she said, setting the spatula down. "What on earth are you doing here, sweetheart? Shouldn't you be in Seattle taking your exam today?" I stared at her, my brain misfiring, refusing to process the image in front of me. She looked entirely healthy. Her cheeks had their usual pink flush. Her hands were steady and she was breathing normally. I whispered that Mom had called me last night and said she had a stroke and was dying. Grandma Evelyn frowned, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "A stroke?" she asked, stepping around the island to pull me into a hug. "Oh, honey, no." She explained that she had felt a little dizzy while gardening in the heat yesterday and called my mother for a ride to the urgent care clinic. The doctor told her she was dehydrated, gave her an intravenous fluid drip, and sent her home by 6 o'clock. She told me she was perfectly fine. Just then, the back door creaked open. Heavy footsteps sounded on the porch stairs. My father walked into the kitchen, followed closely by my mother. They were holding paper coffee cups from a local bakery. They did not look like parents who had spent the night holding vigil over a dying woman. They looked like people returning from a leisurely Sunday errand. Richard stopped when he saw me standing by the island, but Linda did not even drop her coffee. She did not rush forward to apologize for the miscommunication. Instead, she rolled her eyes and let out a long, exasperated sigh. "Emilia, what are you doing here?" she asked, her tone dripping with annoyance. "You are supposed to be taking your test today." The aircraft hit the tarmac with a heavy jolt, rattling my bones and pulling me from a restless, disorienting fog. I had not slept a single minute since that devastating phone call. My entire system felt flooded with a toxic cocktail of adrenaline, dread, and stale airline coffee. When the seatbelt sign chimed, I practically shoved my way into the aisle, ignoring the irritated glares of the business travelers around me. I grabbed my overnight bag and hurried off the plane, my heart hammering against my ribs. The terminal at 5:30 in the morning was a ghost town. The squeak of my sneakers against the polished floors echoed through the empty concourse, but I did not stop walking. I kept my phone pressed tight against my ear, listening to the rhythmic ringing on the other end, desperate for any update on the woman who had essentially raised me. I dialed my father, Richard, first. Growing up, he was the family crisis manager, a man who handled the logistics of our lives with a detached corporate efficiency. If a car broke down or a financial issue arose, Richard made a single stern phone call and fixed the problem. He demanded order and obedience from everyone in his orbit. I desperately needed his composed voice to tell me which intensive care unit to go to, but the call went straight to voicemail. His recorded greeting was brisk and clipped. I hung up and immediately dialed my younger sister, Britney. The line rang 4 times before her automated voice answered. Britney rarely answered my calls anyway. She was usually too busy curating her flawless life for social media or spending our father's credit cards on weekend trips she labeled as networking. But surely, tonight of all nights, she would have her device glued to her palm. Our grandmother was dying. We were supposed to be a family rallying around a hospital bed. The suffocating quiet from both of them felt heavy and wrong. I burst through the sliding glass doors of the terminal and stepped into the humid morning air. The sky above the city was the color of bruised iron. I jumped into the first available taxi and gave the driver the address for the county hospital, the largest trauma center in the area. I told him to step on the gas, offering him a $50 cash tip if he got me to the emergency room in under 20 minutes. He nodded, pulling away from the curb and taking the highway on-ramp with a squeal of tires. I spent the entire ride staring out the passenger window, watching the familiar flat landscape blur past. My chest ached with a sharp physical pressure. I was terrified that I was already too late to say goodbye. The hospital automatic doors parted and I ran into the emergency room. The air inside smelled like industrial bleach and stale sweat. A few people slumped in the rigid plastic waiting chairs, looking exhausted and gray under the harsh fluorescent lights. I sprinted straight to the triage desk, my canvas bag slipping off my shoulder. The nurse behind the thick plexiglass barrier looked up with kind, tired eyes. I planted my hands on the counter, trying to catch my breath. I told her I needed the room number for Evelyn Afton and explained she had been brought in last night after a severe stroke. The nurse nodded, typing the name into her keyboard. The clacking of the plastic keys sounded like gunshots in the quiet room. I watched her screen, waiting for the room number to appear, but her brow furrowed. She backspaced and typed the last name again. "I am sorry," she said, looking up at me. "We do not have an Evelyn Afton admitted here." I blinked, the words failing to register in my brain. I shook my head, gripping the edge of the counter harder. I pleaded with her to check the intensive care unit. I told her my mother called me near midnight and said the stroke was fatal. The nurse checked another screen, her expression softening into that practiced clinical sympathy medical professionals use for grieving families. "I checked the entire hospital census," she replied gently. "There is no Evelyn Afton here." She asked if I was sure the ambulance brought her to this specific facility. A cold, sharp spike of panic drove straight through my ribs. I pulled my phone out and dialed my mother again, my hands shaking so badly I dropped the device onto the floor. I snatched it up and pressed call. It rang twice before Linda answered. "Mom," I shouted, standing in the middle of the emergency room. I told her the nurse said Grandma was not there and asked if she had been transferred. There was a long pause on the line. I strained to hear the background noise, expecting the beep of medical monitors or the murmur of doctors. Instead, I heard the faint sound of a television playing a morning talk show. "Oh, Emilia," my mother said. Her voice sounded strangely calm, flat, almost bored. She told me they had taken her back to her house and just to come there. I froze as the hospital noise faded into a dull ring in my ears. I repeated her words, they tasted wrong in my mouth. I asked how they could take a critical stroke victim home the next morning. I asked if she was on hospice or if she was comfortable. My mother just sighed, sounding irritated that I was even asking questions. She told me they were all there and to just get a cab. Then the line went dead. I stood in the emergency room staring at the dark screen of my phone. Nothing about the situation aligned with reality. Hospitals do not discharge active stroke patients a few hours after admission. They do not send dying women home without a care team. I walked back out to the taxi stand, operating on pure mechanical instinct. I gave the driver the address for Grandma Evelyn's modest ranch house in the suburbs. The ride took 30 minutes, but those minutes stretched into an eternity. I leaned my head against the cool glass of the window, trying to prepare myself for what I was about to see. I pictured a rented hospital bed set up in the living room. I pictured IV poles and oxygen tanks. I braced myself for the smell of sickness and the sound of labored breathing. That house was the place where I had spent my summers hiding from my father's impossible expectations and my mother's constant criticism. While Richard and Linda molded Britney into their perfect prodigy, Evelyn let me read books on her porch and told me I was going to be a brilliant lawyer someday. She was my sanctuary, the only one who believed in my intellect. The cab pulled up to the curb. The neighborhood was quiet, bathed in the soft golden light of early morning. I stepped out into the damp grass, noting that the house looked exactly the same. The wooden porch swing still hung from its chains, and the flower beds were neatly weeded. There was no ambulance parked in the driveway. There were no cars belonging to hospice nurses or emergency personnel. Just my father's sleek silver sedan parked near the garage. I walked up the concrete path, my legs feeling heavy and unresponsive. Every step required a conscious command from my brain. I reached the front door and took one final deep breath, trying to fortify my heart for the worst goodbye of my life. I turned the brass knob and pushed the door open, stepping into the hallway. The world simply stopped making sense. I had braced for the sterile smell of rubbing alcohol and sickness. I expected hushed voices and the rhythmic beep of medical equipment. Instead, the warm, heavy scent of cinnamon sugar and melting butter hit my face. The house was bright with morning sunlight streaming through the sheer curtains in the living room. I heard the soft hum of the refrigerator and the clinking of metal against ceramic. I walked slowly toward the kitchen, and my overnight bag slipped from my shoulder, hitting the floor with a dull thud. My grandmother was not lying in a rented hospital bed. She was standing at her kitchen island wearing her favorite yellow floral apron tied neatly around her waist. She held a metal spatula in one hand and was sliding perfectly round snickerdoodle cookies onto a wire cooling rack. She looked up when my bag hit the floor, her eyes widening behind her wire-rimmed glasses. "Emilia," she said, setting the spatula down. "What on earth are you doing here, sweetheart? Shouldn't you be in Seattle taking your exam today?" I stared at her, my brain misfiring, refusing to process the image in front of me. She looked entirely healthy. Her cheeks had their usual pink flush, her hands were steady, and she was breathing normally. I whispered that Mom had called me last night and said she had a stroke and was dying. Grandma Evelyn frowned, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "A stroke?" she asked, stepping around the island to pull me into a hug. "Oh, honey, no." She explained that she had felt a little dizzy while gardening in the heat yesterday and called my mother for a ride to the urgent care clinic. The doctor told her she was dehydrated, gave her an intravenous fluid drip, and sent her home by 6 o'clock. She told me she was perfectly fine. Just then the back door creaked open. Heavy footsteps sounded on the porch stairs. My father walked into the kitchen, followed closely by my mother. They were holding paper coffee cups from a local bakery. They did not look like parents who had spent the night holding vigil over a dying woman. They looked like people returning from a leisurely Sunday errand. Richard stopped when he saw me standing by the island, but Linda did not even drop her coffee. She did not rush forward to apologize for the miscommunication. Instead, she rolled her eyes and let out a long, exasperated sigh. "Emilia, what are you doing here?" she asked, her tone dripping with annoyance. "You are supposed to be taking your test today." I sat on the wooden step staring at the #Golden Girl on my phone screen. The numb, hollow feeling in my chest began to recede. It was replaced by a heat that started in my stomach and radiated outward to my fingertips. It was not the chaotic, frantic panic from the airport earlier that morning. This was something else. It was a cold, sharp, calculating fury. My parents had spent my entire life allocating every scrap of resource to Britney while ignoring my struggles. They had dismissed my achievements and forgotten my milestones as if they were inconvenient footnotes in the family history. I had long ago accepted my role as the invisible, independent daughter. I never asked them for money or favors. I only asked to be left alone to build my own life brick by brick. But ignoring me was no longer enough for them. They had actively reached into my world and destroyed my future just to clear a path for my sister. They stole my time, my money, and my peace of mind. They looked at my 3 years of suffering, my endless nights of studying, and my crushing financial debt, and decided it was an acceptable sacrifice. My entire life was just collateral damage, so Britney could post a smiling photograph with an iced coffee and claim a title she did not earn. I listened to my father laugh again inside the kitchen. The sound scraped against my nerves like a rough stone. He thought he had won. He thought he had successfully managed the situation, neutralized the threat, and secured his favorite daughter the spotlight. He assumed I was just the emotional, overreacting scapegoat who would cry on the porch and eventually accept her ruined circumstances. He expected me to pack my bags, apologize for the misunderstanding, and quietly retreat to Seattle as a failure. I pressed the power button on my phone, turning the screen black. I slipped the device back into my pocket. My hands were no longer shaking. My breathing slowed, matching a new, steady rhythm. The confusion and the grief were gone. Only clarity remained. I stood up from the porch step. The wood creaked under my shoes. I rolled my shoulders back, feeling the tension settle into a hard knot at the base of my neck. I did not feel like crying anymore. I turned around and faced the front door. It was time to walk back into that kitchen and let them know that the daughter they thought they broke was about to become their worst nightmare. I walked back through the front door and the screen door shut behind me with a soft click. The kitchen was still bathed in that warm morning light. My father was leaning against the counter holding his coffee. My mother was picking out a muffin on a ceramic plate. Grandma Evelyn was at the sink washing a mixing bowl. The domestic tranquility of the scene felt like a physical insult. I did not yell, and I did not throw anything. I simply walked straight up to my father and held my phone directly in his line of sight. The screen was bright, displaying Britney and her iced latte in Ohio. My father looked down at the device. I watched his eyes scan the image. I watched him read the caption. I waited for the panic. I waited for the color to drain from his face, or for him to stammer out a frantic excuse. He did neither. Richard Afton let out a slow, measured sigh. He reached up and rubbed the bridge of his nose like a manager dealing with a slightly annoying employee. He set his coffee mug down on the granite counter with a deliberate clink. Britney needed a win, Emilia, he said. His voice was entirely level, devoid of any guilt or hesitation. He told me she had been struggling, and that I knew how hard this year had been on her confidence. I stared at him. My own father was looking me in the eye, admitting he had orchestrated a fake medical emergency to sabotage my law career, and he was treating it like a minor scheduling adjustment. You lied to me, I said, my voice dropping to a low tremor. I told him he said Grandma was dying just so I would miss the exam today. I told him he stole 3 years of my life, so Britney could pretend she was the smart one. My mother stepped forward, her face hardening. Do not speak to your father that way, she scolded. She said he was just trying to protect this family, and that I was always so focused on myself. My father nodded in agreement. You are the strong one, Emilia, he said, folding his arms. He told me I had always been fine on my own. He said I could just take the test next cycle, and that it was not the end of the world. He asked why I had to be so incredibly selfish about this. The word selfish hung in the air. I looked at the man who had funded my sister's luxury apartment while I worked double shifts at a diner to pay for my textbooks. He was calling me selfish for wanting to take an exam I had earned the right to sit for. He genuinely believed that my suffering was an acceptable price to pay for Britney to feel good about herself. Grandma Evelyn dropped a wet sponge into the sink. The loud slap of the sponge hitting the stainless steel made my parents flinch. She turned around, wiping her wet hands on her apron. Her face was pale and her hands were trembling, but her eyes were furious. Richard Evelyn said, her voice shaking with a quiet, devastating rage. She told them both to get out of her house right now, before she called the police to have them removed. My father opened his mouth to argue, but Evelyn took a step forward, pointing a sharp finger toward the back door. "Do not say a single word to me," she commanded. She told him he was a disgrace of a father and ordered them out. My parents exchanged a look of offended indignity. They picked up their coats and walked out the back door, muttering about how everyone was overreacting. The heavy wooden door slammed shut behind them. I did not stay to cry. I walked into the guest bedroom and picked up my overnight bag. I zipped it shut with numb fingers. When I walked back into the kitchen, Evelyn was standing by the door holding her car keys. She did not offer me platitudes or tell me everything was going to be okay. She just hugged me fiercely, pulling me tight against her shoulder. "I am so sorry, my girl," she whispered into my hair. She told me to go back to Seattle and build my life and not to let them take another second of my time. I kissed her on the cheek. I walked out to the driveway and ordered a cab back to the airport. I flew back to Seattle that same afternoon, leaving my family behind in Indiana. I thought the betrayal was over, but I underestimated their need to control the narrative. The moment I stopped answering their phone calls, the smear campaign began. I thought cutting contact would be the end of the conflict, but I underestimated the lengths a toxic family will go to preserve their own image. Within 3 weeks of my return to Washington, the telephone rang, and the caller identification showed my Aunt Susan. She was my father's sister and the primary conduit for every piece of gossip that flowed through our extended family tree. I answered the call out of a morbid sense of curiosity, wanting to see exactly how far the rot had spread. "Emilia, honey." Aunt Susan whispered, her voice dripping with a thick, manufactured sympathy that made my skin crawl. She told me she was just calling to check on me because my mother had told everyone what happened during my testing weekend. She said the entire family was deeply worried about my mental state. I sat on the edge of the mattress in my apartment and asked her what exactly my mother had said. Aunt Susan sighed heavily, leaning into the drama of the moment. She claimed my mother told the family I failed the bar exam terribly. She said the pressure had been too much, and that I had suffered a severe nervous breakdown the night before the first session. The narrative they were spinning was that I showed up in Indiana, highly unstable, and they had to send me home to recover. She told me my mother wanted everyone to pray for my recovery. I closed my eyes as the sheer audacity of the lie settled over me. They had flipped the reality flawlessly, erasing their own manipulation and casting themselves as the concerned parents of a tragic broken daughter. It was not just my aunt who was being fed this poison. The infection was spreading through their entire social circle. My father was telling his golf buddies at the country club that I simply could not handle the academic rigor of the legal field. He was shaking his head on the putting green, playing the part of the disappointed but loving patriarch, telling everyone I had given up on law entirely. A few months later, the final piece of their twisted reality fell into place when Britney passed the Ohio bar exam on her third attempt. She barely cleared the minimum required score, but to my parents, the margin did not matter. They threw a lavish celebration at a downtown steakhouse and bought her a luxury watch to commemorate her achievement. They proudly announced to every neighbor and business associate that they had raised a brilliant legal prodigy. The contrast they painted was deliberate and cruel, making Britney the shining success story, while I was the unstable failure who cracked under pressure. If you have ever had your reputation destroyed by a toxic parent, you know the crushing isolation of that moment. You realize that the people who were supposed to protect your name are the ones actively setting fire to it. My initial instinct was to fight back with everything I had. I wanted to post the truth on social media for everyone to see. I wanted to call every relative and family friend and scream the facts into the telephone. I wanted to expose the fake stroke, the sabotage, and the sheer cold-bloodedness of what they did. But I realized something important as I sat alone in my apartment, looking at my empty bank account. Fighting a smear campaign is a trap designed to drain your energy. If I screamed and defended myself, I would only look exactly how they described me. I would look unstable and bitter, giving them the evidence they needed to validate their lies. So I made a choice that felt like swallowing glass. I chose total silence. I did not correct my aunt, and I did not respond to the pitying text messages from distant cousins. I did not defend my intellect or my sanity to people who were committed to misunderstanding me. I let them tell their stories, and I let my father play the victim at his club. I let Britney wear her unearned crown while I embraced the quiet. I chose this path because silence is the ultimate incubator for success. While they were busy maintaining their fragile house of cards in Indiana, I was preparing to build something undeniable. I took a low-paying job as a paralegal at a fierce corporate litigation firm because I knew the legal profession does not care about family drama. The law is a cold machine that only cares about work preparation and intellect. I carried boxes of files and worked 12-hour days surviving on ramen noodles and studying in the dark, quiet hours of the morning. I became a ghost to my past, so I could become a weapon in my future. I knew that the truth does not need to be shouted to be real. The truth just needs time, and I was willing to wait. My father did not just let me walk away quietly. He believed money was a leash, and he assumed I would come crawling back the moment things became difficult. 3 days after I arrived back in the city, my emergency credit card was declined at a grocery store checkout lane. The representative at the bank informed me the primary account holder had canceled the card and severed my access to the family trust. It was his final warning shot, telling me that if I did not play my assigned role as the failure, I would have to survive entirely on my own. I found a tiny studio apartment in a decaying brick building far outside the trendy neighborhoods. The radiator clanked all night, and the window draft required me to sleep in a heavy sweater just to stay warm. I furnished the space with a mattress I bought secondhand and a wobbly card table that served as my dining room and my desk. Every morning I counted exact change for the train fare because I had zero financial safety net. If I lost my job, I was going to be homeless. Meanwhile, Britney was playing the role of the conquering hero in Indiana. Aunt Susan made sure to text me unprompted updates about how well my sister was doing. My father had pulled a favor with an old friend who owned a defense firm, and they created a junior associate position exclusively for her. She spent her days attending long corporate lunches and posting photographs of her expensive leather briefcase, while paralegals drafted all her actual motions. She was handed a career on a silver platter wrapped in my stolen future. But I stayed focused on the arena I was building for myself. I needed a job to keep the electricity on, and I needed to get back into the fight. I applied for dozens of positions, but without a license, I was restricted to support staff roles. I eventually landed an interview at a boutique corporate litigation firm known for taking on impossible cases and dismantling opposing counsel with ruthless efficiency. They did not hire me as a lawyer yet. They hired me as a paralegal making $15 an hour. My existence became an exercise in extreme endurance, but I knew I was just waiting for the moment to step out of the shadows. My daily existence at Caldwell and Associates became a study in invisibility. The firm was a fortress of frosted glass and dark mahogany located in the heart of the city, and the senior partners moved through the corridors like gods of industry. They did not know my name, and they certainly did not know that the woman carrying heavy exhibit binders to their conference rooms had graduated near the top of her class. To them, I was just a piece of office furniture that occasionally handed over a summarized deposition or fetched a fresh carafe of water. I clocked in at 7 in the morning and spent 12 hours breathing in the smell of hot printer toner and stale coffee. My job consisted of organizing towering stacks of discovery documents and redacting sensitive financial records with a focus that bordered on the obsessive. The real work, however, began when I punched out and caught the train back to my decaying studio apartment. I lived in a brick building where the elevator was perpetually broken, and the hallways smelled of boiled cabbage and old damp wood. The radiator in my room clanked and hissed all night like a dying beast, and the draft from the window was so severe that I had to wear a heavy wool sweater and a beanie just to sit at my desk. I furnished the space with a second-hand mattress and a wobbly card table that I found on a sidewalk. That table became my altar. From 9 at night until 3 in the morning I studied. I did not have the money to purchase the newest bar prep materials, so I used my old books from the previous year. I highlighted case law until my vision blurred into a gray haze, and I recited the elements of torts and contract law to the empty peeling walls. I was fueled by a pure, unadulterated spite that kept me warmer than the radiator ever could. Every time my stomach growled from a dinner of instant noodles, I thought of my father Richard and the smug look on his face in the kitchen. Every time I counted out exact change for the subway fare, I pictured Britney posting a photo of her designer briefcase from a 3-hour lunch. My parents believed that by cutting off my credit cards and severing my access to the family trust, they were teaching me a lesson in humility. Richard assumed that without his financial safety net, I would crumble and come crawling back to Indiana to play the role of the broken daughter who needed his guidance. He viewed money as a leash and he was waiting for the snap of the collar. But they underestimated the sheer endurance of someone who has already lost everything. I did not celebrate a single holiday that year. On Thanksgiving, I ate a turkey sandwich while outlining property law, and on Christmas morning I watched the snow fall against my drafty window while taking a timed practice test. I became a ghost to my social circle and a stranger to my own family. I ignored the cheerful social media posts of my former classmates taking vacations or starting their associate positions. I understood that silence was my greatest ally. When you stop expending energy trying to convince people of your worth, you can channel all that focus into building something undeniable. The office at Caldwell and Associates was an environment of extreme pressure where mistakes were not tolerated. The managing partner, Victoria Caldwell, was a legend who built her corporate litigation empire from nothing. She was known for an icy demeanor and a razor-sharp intellect that could dismantle a witness in seconds without ever raising her voice. I watched her from a distance, taking mental notes on how she controlled a room and how she used silence to force opposing counsel into making errors. I realized that the law is not about who is right, but about who is better prepared and who has the stronger will. Financial ruin was a constant threat hanging over my head. My student loans were entering repayment, and the interest was mounting. I picked up weekend shifts doing freelance data entry for a local real estate agent just to cover the exorbitant registration fee for the next bar exam. There were moments in the middle of the night when the cold in the apartment felt personal, and the weight of my debt felt like it would crush my chest. I wondered if my parents were right, and if I was just being stubborn. But then I would remember the phone call. I would remember the sound of my mother faking a tragedy to steal my future, and the fire would reignite. I was learning things as a paralegal that law school never taught me. I was seeing the raw mechanics of how power is wielded in the American legal system. I learned how to build a paper trail that functions like an invisible net, and how to read the arrogance of an opponent to find their weakest point. I realized that my father's business success was built on a foundation of intimidation rather than actual legal strategy. He was a big fish in a small pond in Indiana, but in a place like the Chicago Loop, he would be shredded in minutes. I was becoming a weapon specifically designed to cut through the kind of bullshit he used to run his life. Britney's updates continued to arrive via Aunt Susan's passive-aggressive texts. My sister was apparently a rising star at her firm, though I knew better. I knew she was being protected by my father's fraternity connections, and that her motions were being ghostwritten by people who actually knew what they were doing. She was living the life of a legal professional without ever having to face the fire. She was soft and she was entitled, and she had no idea that I was still in the game. I let her enjoy her unearned crown, because I knew that a crown held together by lies is a very heavy thing to wear when the wind starts to change. The winter in Washington was brutal, and the gray sky seemed to mirror the exhaustion in my bones. I was surviving on 3 hours of sleep and the adrenaline of a looming deadline. I had registered for the February exam in total secrecy, and I had told no one at the office. I did not want pity, and I did not want expectations. I just wanted to walk into that convention center and take back what was stolen from me. I had memorized the rules of evidence while standing in the shower and practiced my opening statements while walking to the train. I was no longer the girl who ran through an airport crying for her grandmother. I was a professional operating with surgical precision. By the time late February arrived, I felt a strange, profound calm, I packed my pencils and my identification card, and I walked into the freezing convention center downtown. The room was cavernous and filled with hundreds of nervous graduates who were frantically reviewing flashcards and whispering definitions. I just found my assigned seat and set my things down. I did not look at anyone else. I felt like a hunter who had finally cornered my prey. When the proctor announced the start of the exam and the sound of hundreds of pages flipping echoed through the hall, I did not panic. Every question I read felt familiar. I poured every ounce of my betrayal and my anger onto those answer sheets. I treated the exam like a battlefield, and I dismantled the prompts with a cold efficiency. For 2 days, I sat under those glaring lights and took back my future. When I walked out into the biting wind, I knew exactly what I had done. I did not need to wait for a score to know that the girl my parents tried to break was gone forever. I was coming for the life they thought they had erased, and I was going to do it in a way they never saw coming. The waiting period for bar exam results is a specific kind of torture that the legal profession inflicts on its initiates. It is 4 long months of silence where every conversation you had with yourself during the test is replayed and scrutinized in the dark. I spent those months continuing my grueling routine at Caldwell and Associates, keeping my head down and filing the endless mountains of paperwork that defined my existence as a paralegal. My colleagues still treated me with a casual indifference, unaware that the person fetching their lunch was waiting for a digital notification that would change the trajectory of her life. I worked in a state of suspended animation, operating on pure mechanical instinct while the humid Chicago summer began to bake the city streets. Finally, on a Tuesday afternoon in late June, the email arrived. I was sitting at my cramped desk during my lunch break, surrounded by the smell of hot printer toner and the low hum of the office. My heart hammered against my ribs so hard, I thought the people at the next cubicle would hear it. I clicked the link to the state board portal and typed in my applicant number with fingers that refused to stay steady. I hit enter and watched the screen refresh. The word pass appeared in bold green letters across the top of the browser. I stared at it until the letters blurred, but it was the score breakdown further down the page that caused the breath to catch in my throat. I had scored in the 98th percentile. I had not just passed, I had dominated the grading curve on every single essay, securing a score high enough to practice law in any jurisdiction in the country. I did not scream or jump up from my chair. I did not call my parents to beg for their approval or post a celebratory photograph on social media. I simply closed the window and went back to organizing an exhibit binder, a secret power humming beneath my skin. That weekend, I walked to a discount craft store and bought a cheap black plastic frame. I printed my official license to practice law on heavy cardstock and slipped it behind the glass. I hung it on the cracked plaster wall of my studio apartment, directly above the wobbly card table, where I had spent hundreds of hours in the dark. There was no champagne, and there were no congratulatory toasts from wealthy family friends. There was only the quiet satisfaction of knowing that this belonged entirely to me. My father could not cancel it, my mother could not twist the narrative around it, and Britney could not steal it. To my parents and their eager audience of gossip-hungry relatives back in Indiana, I was still the fragile dropout who had crumbled under the pressure. Aunt Susan's texts continued to arrive like clockwork, detailing Britney's latest unearned achievements at her boutique firm. They believed I was trapped at the bottom of the career ladder carrying boxes for real lawyers while I slowly disappeared into obscurity. They had no idea that I was quietly sharpening my skills inside one of the most ruthless litigation firms in the Midwest. I was no longer a victim of their manipulation. I was a licensed weapon waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I maintained my role as a paralegal with a newfound focus. I began to look at the cases moving through the firm, not just as tasks to be completed, but as puzzles to be solved. I read every motion, every deposition, and every footnote in the discovery files. I was learning the rhythm of the courtroom from the masters of the craft, watching how they exploited the smallest procedural errors to dismantle their opponents. I was building a mental database of strategies that my sister would never understand, because she had never been forced to fight for her seat at the table. My life was bifurcated. By day, I was the invisible support staff fetching coffee, and by night, I was a legal scholar perfecting my understanding of federal statutes. The tension within me grew as the months passed. I felt like a coiled spring ready to release, but waiting for the right trigger. I knew that eventually my path would cross with the Afton family again. The law is a small world, and arrogance like my father's always leaves a paper trail that someone like me can follow. Every time I saw a news report about a regional business facing litigation or a labor dispute, I checked the docket to see if his name appeared. I was patient because I knew that the truth does not need to be shouted to be real. It just needs time to manifest. My financial situation remained tight, but the desperation had been replaced by a cold, calculating resolve. I was no longer afraid of the dark or the clanking radiator. I found a strange comfort in the sparse reality of my apartment because it reminded me that I owed my parents nothing. I had survived the worst they could throw at me, and I had come out the other side with a license and a grudge. I was a ghost in their narrative, a blank space they filled with their own lies, and that was exactly how I wanted it to stay. Then a new conflict began to stir within the walls of Caldwell and Associates. The firm had taken on a massive corporate merger, and the atmosphere was electric with the kind of stress that breaks lesser attorneys. The workload was crushing, and the senior partners were on edge, demanding perfection from everyone, including the paralegals. I saw my opportunity in a stack of financial disclosures that had been dismissed as routine. While the rest of the staff was rushing to meet the filing deadline, I sat in the glow of my desk lamp and began to dig into the footnotes of page 412. I found an anomaly in the depreciation assets that suggested something far more sinister than a simple accounting error. I stayed late long after the cleaning crew had finished their rounds, cross-referencing tax identification numbers with the Delaware Corporate Registry. I was so engrossed in the money trail that I did not hear the click of heels on the hardwood floor behind me. When Victoria Caldwell's voice cut through the silence, I realized that my period of invisibility was over. I had found the fraud, and in doing so, I had exposed myself. I stood up, smoothing my skirt, and preparing for the confrontation that would either end my career or finally start it. I looked at the red ink on my legal pad, and then at the legendary litigator standing in my cubicle, and I knew that the secret I had been keeping for a year was about to become the very thing that saved me. The rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the empty suite, turning the glittering city lights into distorted smears of yellow and red. It was 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night in November, and the silence of the Caldwell and Associates headquarters was absolute, save for the hum of the ventilation system. I sat at a cramped cubicle near the copy room, my face illuminated by the harsh white glow of a single desk lamp. The cleaning staff had already made their rounds, leaving the scent of lemon polish lingering in the air. I was deep in the trenches of a high-stakes corporate merger file, a mountain of financial disclosures that the senior associates had dismissed as a routine verification task. They had spent weeks scanning headers and filing summaries, but I did not just scan, I read the footnotes. I was tracing a line of depreciation assets that felt mathematically thin when I noticed a glaring anomaly. The reported numbers simply did not align with the stated revenue streams from the previous quarter. I pulled up the Delaware Corporate Registry on my secondary monitor, my eyes darting between tax identification numbers and nested appendices. On page 412, buried in a section designed to look like a dry list of equipment leases, I found the fracture. The opposing counsel was attempting to hide a shell company carrying $3 million in toxic debt. They were dressing up a failing asset to look like a lucrative acquisition, hoping our firm would be too busy with the big picture to notice the rot at the foundation. I grabbed a red pen and began drafting a legal memo on a yellow pad, my handwriting sharp and urgent. I mapped the money trail, citing specific corporate statutes and outlining the fraudulent intent with the precision of a surgeon. I was so engrossed in the puzzle that I did not hear the click of heels on the hardwood floor behind me. "You are a paralegal," a voice said. It cut through the quiet hum of the office like a steel blade. I jumped, my heart leaping into my throat as I nearly knocked over my cold coffee. Victoria Caldwell was standing directly behind my chair, her dark eyes fixed on my legal pad. She wore a pristine black trench coat that was still beaded with rainwater, and she held a leather briefcase with a grip that suggested she never let go of anything. I stood up immediately, smoothing my skirt and stammering an apology about organizing exhibits for the morning briefing. Victoria did not look at me. She reached down and picked up my legal pad, her eyes scanning my handwritten notes and the cited statutes. The silence that followed lasted a long, agonizing minute. In a firm like this, paralegals were strictly forbidden from offering formal legal analysis. It was a fireable offense, a breach of the rigid hierarchy that kept the machine running. I braced myself for the speech about staying in my lane, mentally preparing to pack my few personal belongings and return to the freezing studio apartment for good. "Why are you doing forensic financial accounting on a Tuesday night?" Victoria asked, looking up from the notepad. Her tone was not angry. It was intensely curious, her gaze searching my face for a flicker of fear or an excuse. I took a breath, feeling the instinct to shrink away to play the role of the obedient support staff. But then I remembered the cheap black frame hanging on my wall. I remembered the 98th percentile score and the year I spent eating ramen in the dark. I stood my ground. Because opposing counsel hit a toxic shell company on page 412, I said, keeping my voice steady, "They are committing fraud to inflate the acquisition price. And I found it because I am a licensed attorney, Mom." Victoria stopped. The air in the room seemed to shift, the power dynamic recalibrating in an instant. She looked at the file on my desk, then back to me, her expression unreadable. She walked over to her corner office, unlocked the heavy glass door, and turned on the overhead lights. "Bring your notes, Emilia," she commanded. I gathered my files and followed her into a room that overlooked the entire skyline. She sat behind a sprawling mahogany desk and gestured for me to take the chair opposite her, pouring 2 glasses of sparkling water from a crystal carafe. "Explain," she said. I did not give her a rehearsed elevator pitch. I did not try to make myself look like a hero or a martyr. I told her the unvarnished truth. I told her about the midnight phone call 5 years ago, and the fake stroke that cost me my first exam. I described the red-eye flight to Indiana, the scent of snickerdoodles in my grandmother's kitchen, and the devastating realization on the porch when I saw my sister's social media post. I told her how my parents stole my future to protect the ego of their golden child, and how I had spent the last year living as a ghost in Chicago, passing the bar in total secrecy while carrying boxes for her associates. Victoria listened without interrupting, her face a neutral mask. She did not offer me a sympathetic smile or a gasp of horror. Pity is a useless currency to a woman like Victoria Caldwell. She did not build an empire by feeling sorry for people. She built it by identifying talent and weaponizing it. When I finished speaking, she picked up a silver pen and tapped it thoughtfully against the desk. "Family is an accident of biology," she said, her voice cool and pragmatic. "People place far too much value on shared DNA, but blood does not guarantee loyalty, and it certainly does not guarantee respect. Loyalty is something earned in the trenches, not inherited." She opened a sleek desk drawer and pulled out a thick document printed on heavy bond paper. She slid it across the mahogany surface toward me. It was a junior associate employment contract. "You have spent your entire life letting mediocre people dictate your worth." Victoria continued, leaning forward until the light caught the sharpness in her eyes. "You let your parents write your narrative, and you let them convince you that you were a failure because it suited their agenda. That stops tonight. If you sign that contract, you will no longer fetch coffee, and you will never hide your intellect again. I am going to teach you how to dismantle liars for a living. You are going to be a lethal litigator, Emilia." I picked up the pen and signed my name on the dotted line, the ink feeling like a seal on a new life. That night changed the entire trajectory of my existence. Under Victoria's mentorship, I stopped being the girl who ran away from a toxic home and became a weapon. She taught me that the courtroom is not about shouting the loudest. It is about architectural precision. She showed me how to draft discovery requests that function like invisible nets, and how to read the arrogance of opposing counsel to use their own ego against them. Never interrupt an arrogant person when they are making a mistake, she told me. Let them dig their own grave deep enough that they can never climb out, and then you simply hand them the shovel. I spent the next 4 years climbing the ranks at Caldwell and Associates, moving out of the drafty studio and buying a condominium overlooking Lake Michigan. I built a found family of brilliant, driven colleagues who judged me solely on the quality of my character and the sharpness of my mind. The ghost of Indiana faded into the background, a dull ache that I rarely felt anymore. I was a rising star in the Chicago legal district, known for my ability to find the one footnote that could sink a billion-dollar merger. I assumed the war with my parents was over, that I had won by simply moving on. But fate has a strange sense of humor, and while I was becoming a master tactician, Britney was back in Indiana, building a house of cards that was about to collide with a very real disaster. I was just beginning to enjoy my success when a new file landed on my desk, and I realized that the wind was finally starting to shift in a way that would bring the Afton family directly into my line of fire. While I spent my afternoons in a glass conference room high above the city, dissecting complex federal statutes under the watchful eye of Victoria Caldwell, Britney was living a very different version of the legal profession down in Indiana. I did not need to hire a private investigator to know exactly what my sister was doing. I just had to look at my phone. My Aunt Susan remained an endless fountain of unprompted information, frequently sending me links to social media posts, accompanied by passive-aggressive text messages about how well the family was doing without me. She thought these updates would make me jealous, genuinely believing I would sit in my apartment and weep over my sister's glamorous lifestyle. Instead, I viewed her messages as a fascinating case study in corporate negligence. My father had officially appointed Britney as the corporate counsel for Afton Freight, his regional logistics company. It was a title that commanded immediate respect in the business world. In the real world, serving as in-house counsel requires a grueling mastery of employment regulations, contract negotiation, and risk mitigation. You are the shield that protects the entire organization from catastrophic liability, reviewing every word of every document because a single misplaced comma can cost a business millions of dollars. Britney, however, treated the role like an audition for a reality television show. Her social media feed was an endless parade of short videos showing her walking into the headquarters wearing expensive designer suits and holding iced coffees. She set her camera up on her polished mahogany desk to record time-lapse videos of herself typing fiercely on her keyboard, posting aesthetic photographs of expensive sushi lunches with the caption, "Boss Babe." She curated an image of a fierce, successful woman dominating a male-heavy industry, but the internet filters could not hide the reality of her profound incompetence. If you paused those videos and looked closely at the documents scattered across her desk, you could see the disaster unfolding in real time. She was approving standard vendor agreements without reading the fine print. In the logistics industry, vendor contracts are literal minefields. Because a transportation company deals with heavy machinery, independent contractors, and dangerous freight. I watched her brag online about closing a new warehouse lease in record time, but any first-year associate knows that when a commercial landlord rushes a lease, they are hiding unfavorable terms. Britney signed it without requesting a single revision, binding our father's company to an indemnity clause that held Afton Freight responsible for any structural failures in the building. She signed away their legal defenses because she wanted to leave the office early for a nail appointment. She missed crucial filing deadlines for state transport permits and drafted employee handbooks by copying and pasting policies she found on the internet, failing to realize those policies applied to California labor laws instead of Indiana. She was a walking malpractice suit waiting to happen. Under normal circumstances, a corporate board of directors would fire an attorney that reckless within a single month, but Britney did not report to a board. She reported to Richard Afton. My father spent his days quietly walking behind her holding a metaphorical broom and sweeping up her catastrophic mistakes. When a parts vendor threatened to sue over a breached contract, Britney ignored the emails, so Richard intercepted them. He authorized quiet, out-of-court settlements, paying tens of thousands of dollars to silence angry business partners. He classified these payouts as miscellaneous operating expenses to hide them from the company accountants covering her tracks with a desperate, frantic energy. He had to keep her illusion alive because the psychology behind his actions was dark and simple. Richard knew exactly what he had done to me. He knew he orchestrated a fake medical emergency, pulled me out of my testing center, and banished me from the family. If he admitted that Britney was a terrible lawyer, he would have to face the sickening reality that he had ruined his brilliant daughter for nothing at all. He would have to look in the mirror and see a fool, so he doubled down instead. He decided to buy her success no matter the cost. The financial drain of maintaining the golden child began to rot the foundation of Afton Freight. Britney demanded a salary that rivaled senior partners at major law firms, claiming she needed the money to project an image of success that would attract better corporate clients. My father agreed and increased her pay. When she wanted a luxury townhouse in the most expensive neighborhood in Indianapolis, he co-signed the mortgage. When she accumulated staggering credit card debt buying the designer clothes featured in her videos, he quietly paid off the balances. He even bought her a membership to the local country club, paying the exorbitant initiation fee from the company expense account. But Afton Freight was a mid-sized regional carrier that operated on razor-thin profit margins. You cannot extract hundreds of thousands of dollars for personal vanity without starving the operational budget. My father began to squeeze the company to fund my sister's delusions of grandeur. He delayed upgrading the shipping fleet, forcing drivers to operate aging trucks that required constant maintenance. He canceled the annual bonuses for the warehouse staff and began taking out high-interest short-term business loans just to make payroll. All while Britney drove a brand-new imported sports car into the executive parking lot every morning. Richard even quietly took out a second mortgage on his own home to keep the company solvent. The facade remained intact for the country club audience. Richard still played golf on Sunday mornings, bragging about his brilliant daughter who handled all his legal affairs. The neighbors still praised Linda for raising such a successful young woman. They looked like the perfect American family, wealthy, secure, and legally protected. They built a towering house of cards on the foundation of my stolen exam day. They stacked lies on top of pride and glued it all together with borrowed money. It was a beautiful structure if you only looked at the outside, but a house of cards has zero structural integrity. It cannot withstand outside pressure and does not need a hurricane to collapse. It just needs a slight change in the wind. And the wind was shifting. While Britney was busy picking out filters for her social media updates, she was ignoring the most critical aspect of corporate logistics, the workforce. Afton Freight employed hundreds of truck drivers, hard-working men and women who drove long, grueling hours and relied on steady paychecks to feed their families. They noticed when their route reimbursements were suddenly denied. They noticed when their hours were shaved down to avoid overtime pay. They saw the young corporate counsel stepping out of a sports car while their own wages stagnated and their safety concerns went unanswered. Discontent is a quiet poison that starts in the break room and spreads to the loading docks. It jumps from driver to driver until it forms a unified front. My father thought he was untouchable because he believed his own manufactured reality. He thought he could exploit his workers indefinitely to fund his daughter's vanity, and that she would be smart enough to protect him from the consequences. He had no idea that the legal shield he relied on was made of thin paper. Sitting in my office in Chicago, I did not know the exact details of their financial ruin yet, but I knew the inevitable math of arrogance. Arrogance always leaves a paper trail, and I was preparing for the moment that paper trail landed on a litigator's desk. I knew a storm was coming for them, but I had not realized yet that I was going to be the one holding the lightning. 5 years is a long time to live inside a manufactured reality, but it is the exact amount of time reality needs to sharpen its teeth. While my sister was busy picking out the right filter for her next social media update, she was ignoring the fact that a corporation is only as strong as the people who keep its wheels turning. For half a decade, Afton Freight had survived by exploiting the very men and women who slept in truck stops and drove through blinding snowstorms to ensure my father's profit margins remained high enough to fund a lifestyle he could not actually afford. Richard had systematically misclassified hundreds of full-time drivers as independent contractors. In the American logistics industry, this is a common but incredibly dangerous gamble. It allows a company to bypass paying for health benefits, overtime wages, and payroll taxes, saving millions in the short term, but creating a ticking time bomb of federal labor violations. The drivers were not stupid, and they certainly were not the lazy workers my father described at his country club dinners. They were working 70-hour weeks under strict company schedules, wearing Afton Freight uniforms, and driving trucks branded with the corporate logo. Legally, they were employees, but Richard refused to acknowledge it because that acknowledgement would mean he could no longer afford Britney's extravagant salary or the mounting debts from her disastrous vendor contracts. Eventually, the breaking point arrived. A group of veteran drivers who had been with the company since before I left for law school quietly organized. They contacted a labor union representative and began gathering years of dispatch records, pay stubs, and internal company emails documenting every single violation. When the bomb finally detonated, it was not a minor regulatory fine or a slap on the wrist from a local inspector. The union filed a massive class action lawsuit against Afton Freight in federal court, citing systemic wage theft, intentional misclassification, and corporate fraud. The initial filing estimated the owed back pay and punitive damages at $8 million. For a regional carrier like my father's company, an $8 million judgment was an existential threat. It was a kill shot. The company did not have that kind of liquid capital, and the lawsuit threatened to liquidate the entire shipping fleet, seize the warehouse properties, and bankrupt my father personally. A rational chief executive facing federal litigation of this magnitude would have panicked and immediately retained a top-tier defense firm specializing in labor law. They would have hired a team of seasoned litigators to negotiate a settlement before the case ever reached a judge's desk. But my father was no longer a rational man. He was trapped inside the delusion he had paid so much to maintain. When the lawsuit landed on his desk, Richard called an emergency meeting with his corporate counsel. He sat across from Britney in his executive office, expecting her to have a strategy. He had spent years convincing himself and the entire state of Indiana that she was a brilliant legal mind, and now he needed her to prove it. Britney had never litigated a federal case in her life. She had never defended a class action lawsuit or stood in front of a federal magistrate. Her entire legal experience consisted of posting aesthetic office photographs and signing terrible vendor agreements that my father had to fix in secret. But she possessed the arrogant confidence of someone who had never been held accountable for a single mistake. She looked at that $8 million figure and told my father exactly what he wanted to hear, because that was the only way she knew how to keep her world from collapsing. She convinced him the lawsuit was nothing more than a frivolous shakedown by disgruntled employees who were jealous of their success. She argued that hiring an expensive outside defense firm would signal weakness to the union and invite more lawsuits in the future. Furthermore, she reminded him that the company could not actually afford the exorbitant retainer fees required by elite trial lawyers because she had already spent that money on her townhouse and her car. Britney promised him she could handle it internally. She claimed she had found a procedural technicality in the union filing and guaranteed she could get the entire case dismissed before it ever went to discovery. My father, desperate to believe the lie that protected his pride, agreed to her plan. He handed the survival of his life's work over to the golden child. He authorized Britney to file the response as the lead defense attorney, and then he went back to the country club. He told his friends that his brilliant daughter was going to crush the greedy union organizers, and they drank expensive scotch and toasted to her legal prowess. They believed they were preparing for a minor skirmish in a local courthouse, but they had absolutely no idea who they were actually fighting. When a labor union decides to take down a corrupt corporation, They do not hire a friendly neighborhood lawyer who handles wills and real estate closings. They look for mercenaries. They seek out a firm with a reputation for mercilessly dismantling corporate fraud, extracting maximum damages, and leaving nothing behind but scorched earth. The union leadership bypassed the local Indiana attorneys entirely and went straight to the financial district of Chicago. They walked into the frosted glass doors of Caldwell and Associates. Victoria Caldwell took the meeting herself. She reviewed the union evidence, the dispatch logs, the altered payroll records, and the aggressive initial response filed by the Afton Freight Corporate Counsel. She recognized the arrogance radiating from the defense strategy and saw a company built on a house of cards defended by a lawyer who clearly did not understand federal labor statutes. Victoria agreed to take the case on contingency, knowing it would be a bloodbath. I was sitting in my office drafting a summary judgment motion for a separate client when the email notification chimed on my computer. It was a firm-wide announcement detailing a new major litigation acquisition. I clicked the message open and began reading the preliminary case details. Plaintiff Indiana Logistics Union, Local Chapter 4, O2. Defendant Afton Freight Incorporated. My pulse spiked as I stared at the name of my father's company displayed in stark black and white text. 5 years of silence and 5 years of building my life from the ground up collided violently with the past I thought I had left behind. My eyes scanned further down the page, looking for the opposing counsel of record. Lead defense attorney Britney Afton. A cold electric shock traveled down my spine as I realized the sister who stole my exam day was now the sole defense, standing between my father and total financial ruin. She was walking blindly into a federal arena against Victoria Caldwell. It was like watching a child wander into a cage with a starved lion. I did not jump out of my chair or run down the hallway to demand the case file. I sat perfectly still, analyzing the geometry of the situation. The odds of this specific case landing on my desk were slim, given that Caldwell and Associates had hundreds of attorneys. But I knew I could not let it go to anyone else. This was not a coincidence. This was the universe delivering karma on a silver platter, and I intended to be the one serving it. I picked up the phone and dialed my managing partner's extension. Victoria answered on the first ring, her voice crisp and impatient, as always. I told her I had just reviewed the intake file for the Indiana Logistics Union case and that I needed her to assign me as the lead litigator. There was a brief pause on the line before she asked why I wanted this specific file. I looked out my window at the Chicago skyline and thought about the red-eye flight, the fake stroke, and the smear campaign that labeled me an unstable failure. I told her the defendant was Richard Afton, my father, and the opposing counsel was the sister they ruined my life to protect. The typing on the other end of the line stopped immediately, and a heavy silence settled over the connection. Victoria was a woman who appreciated irony almost as much as she appreciated winning. She told me she was coming to my office, and the line clicked dead. The confrontation was no longer a hypothetical scenario, and the Afton family was about to face the daughter they threw away in a federal courtroom where lies and social media filters do not matter. The wind was finally picking up, and the house of cards was starting to sway. The confrontation was no longer a hypothetical scenario playing out in the back of my mind. 2 minutes after our line went dead, the heavy oak door to my office swung open, and Victoria Caldwell walked in. She did not bother to knock. She carried a thick, expandable manila folder under her arm, and the expression on her face was entirely unreadable. It was that neutral mask she had perfected over decades of negotiating hostile corporate takeovers. She walked directly to my desk and dropped the heavy file onto the center of my blotter. The thick stack of paper hit the polished wood with a solid, authoritative thud. "Conflict of interest check," she said, her voice sharp and clinical. In the legal profession, a conflict of interest is a fatal variable. If an attorney has a personal or familial relationship with opposing counsel, it can compromise the entire integrity of the case. It gives the losing party grounds to appeal, and it can expose the law firm to severe ethical sanctions. Victoria was not just asking me a personal question. She was protecting her empire. She needed to know if my judgment would be clouded by sentimentality or some lingering sense of childhood affection. The defendant is Richard Afton. She continued, standing tall on the opposite side of my desk. He is your biological father, and the opposing counsel is Britney Afton, your sister. I know your history, Emilia, but I need to hear it from you formally on the record. Do you need me to reassign this litigation to another partner? I stared down at the crisp white label adhered to the corner of the folder, which read, Afton Freight Incorporated. Seeing his name printed in official federal court typography felt surreal. It was a collision of two entirely separate universes. I sat back in my leather chair and let the silence stretch for a moment. I thought about the last 5 years of my life. I thought about the holidays I spent sitting alone in a freezing, drafty studio apartment, eating cheap soup while they toasted with expensive champagne in Indiana. I remembered the sheer suffocating panic of that midnight phone call, and the feeling of my heart dropping into my stomach when I stood in the humid emergency room, begging a triage nurse to find my dying grandmother. I thought about the thousands of dollars I lost, the crushing weight of my student loans, and the arrogant smirk on my father's face when he stood in the kitchen and told me I was the strong one. I remembered the smear campaign. I remembered how they weaponized my absence, twisting my survival into a story of mental instability just to protect their own fragile image. I looked up from the folder and met my mentor's gaze. My pulse was steady, and my breathing was even. There was no hesitation in my chest. There is no conflict of interest, Victoria, I said, keeping my tone even and factual. Richard and Britney Afton made it very clear 5 years ago that we are not a family. They are simply the defendant and the opposing counsel, nothing more. Victoria studied my face for a long, agonizing moment. She was searching for any flicker of doubt or any hidden reservoir of loyalty that might jeopardize the firm. She found nothing but cold, hard resolve. Slowly, the neutral mask slipped from her face, and the corners of her mouth turned upward into a sharp, dangerous smile. It was the expression she wore right before she destroyed a hostile witness on the stand. Good, she said, nodding once, because Britney Afton is already filing motions to dismiss this lawsuit, and they are an absolute mess. Victoria tapped her manicured fingernail against the cover of the folder. The union filed the initial complaint 3 weeks ago, and your sister responded by filing 3 separate motions asking the federal judge to throw the case out before discovery even begins. She thinks she can end this with paperwork. I want you to take the lead on this litigation, Emilia. I want you to handle the strategy, the filings, and the negotiations. I want you to dismantle them. She turned on her heel and walked out of my office, pulling the door shut behind her. I sat alone in the quiet room as the afternoon sun filtered through the large windows, casting long shadows across my desk. I reached out and opened the manila folder, and the smell of fresh ink and legal paper drifted up. I bypassed the union complaint and went straight to the defense responses drafted by the Golden Child. I read through Britney's first motion to dismiss, and I actually had to read it twice because I could not believe what I was seeing. It was a disaster. In federal court, a motion to dismiss is a highly technical document. It requires a precise understanding of civil procedure where you must cite binding precedent and demonstrate that the plaintiff failed to state a legally viable claim. Britney did none of those things. Her filing read like a dramatic complaint letter written to a customer service department. She used emotional language, arguing that the union was being unfair to a hardworking local business. She cited state court cases that had zero jurisdiction in a federal labor dispute. She even included a paragraph detailing how much Afton Freight donated to local charities, as if philanthropy somehow negated federal wage theft. It was embarrassing. It was the work of someone who had coasted through a private law school on her father's checkbook and never bothered to learn the actual mechanics of the justice system. I pulled up her second and third motions, and they were just as bad. She missed formatting rules required by the local district court, and she failed to properly redact sensitive employee information. She was attempting to navigate a complex class action labor dispute using the legal equivalent of blunt crayons. My father had bet his entire company, his fortune, and his legacy on her intellect. He really believed she was a prodigy. He was about to lose everything because he refused to see her for what she truly was. As I sat there reviewing her profound incompetence, a strategy began to form in my mind. If I filed an aggressive immediate response tearing her motions apart, I would tip my hand early. I would alert my father that his legal defense was fatally flawed, and he might panic and finally hire a competent outside firm to replace her. I could not let that happen. I needed Britney to remain the lead counsel. I needed her arrogance to remain unchecked. I decided to play a game of legal attrition. I would draft responses that were technically sound but intentionally restrained. I would point out her procedural errors gently enough that the judge would deny her motions, but subtly enough that Britney would assume we were just playing standard procedural games. I would let her believe she was holding her own. I would give her enough rope to hang the entire company. Furthermore, I made a crucial decision regarding the public docket. In large law firms, junior partners often draft the briefs while the managing partner remains the public face of the litigation. I instructed our paralegals to list Victoria Caldwell as the primary attorney of record on all initial filings. My name would remain buried in the signature blocks listed simply as co-counsel. I knew my father and sister were not detail-oriented people. They would see the prestigious Caldwell letterhead, and they would see Victoria's terrifying name, and they would focus all their anxiety on her. They would never bother to read the fine print at the bottom of the page. They would have no idea that the architect of their impending ruin was sitting in a Chicago office, methodically analyzing their every move. The universe has a funny way of delivering karma. People often expect it to arrive with loud, dramatic fanfare, but true, karma does not need volume. It does not announce itself with a heavy hand. It comes quietly. It arrives in the mail, printed on standard white paper, neatly bound with a blue backing cover. It arrives in the form of a federal summons and a civil complaint. It arrives when arrogant people are finally forced to step into an arena where their money, their social status, and their curated internet personas hold zero value. I spent the rest of the evening sitting at my desk, drafting the legal snare that would eventually catch Afton Freight. For the first time in 5 years, I thought about my father without feeling a single trace of grief. I only felt the cold, precise satisfaction of a litigator holding a winning hand. I packed my briefcase, turned off my office light, and walked to the elevator. The trap was set, and all I had to do now was wait for them to step onto the wire. For the next 6 months, the federal court docket became my personal theater. Every time a notification popped up from the electronic filing system, I poured myself a cup of black coffee, sat back in my leather chair, and watched my sister dismantle our father's empire one careless document at a time. It was not a sudden dramatic collapse, but a slow, methodical unspooling of a corporate entity. I had a front row seat to the exact incompetence my parents had sacrificed my future to protect. Britney was operating with the chaotic, frantic energy of someone trying to fake a book report on a novel they never read, and I was the one holding the grading pen. A competent defense attorney defending a multi-million-dollar labor dispute operates with surgical precision. They file extensions. They bury the plaintiff in procedural hurdles, and they fiercely protect their client's internal data. Britney did none of those things. Her initial errors were procedural, but fatal. She missed the first major deadline for the production of documents, and when our firm filed a notice of deficiency, she panicked. She hastily uploaded a batch of financial ledgers attempting to hide the executive compensation packages by using a digital marker tool to draw black boxes over the numbers. However, she did not flatten the document file before submitting it to the court server. Any junior paralegal with basic software knowledge could simply click on those black boxes and press the delete key. I did exactly that, revealing the bloated salaries my father was drawing while refusing to pay his drivers overtime. I printed those unredacted ledgers, highlighted the figures in yellow ink, and placed them in a growing binder on my desk. Her legal arguments were even worse. She filed a memorandum of law attempting to justify the independent contractor classifications and proudly cited a federal circuit court decision from 2015. She built her entire defense around that single ruling failing to run a basic citation check. The Supreme Court had overturned that exact ruling 3 years later. She was building a fortress on a foundation of dead law. My junior associates were eager to pounce. They walked into my office waving her sloppy filings, asking for permission to draft motions to strike. They wanted to humiliate opposing counsel on the public record and demand judicial sanctions immediately. I told them to stand down. In corporate litigation, when your opponent is busy shooting themselves in the foot, you do not rush across the room to take away the gun. You stand back, remain quiet, and hand them more ammunition. I let her make every single mistake. I let the errors pile up in the official court record, creating an undeniable paper trail of gross negligence. I played a game of legal attrition, drafting responses that were technically sound but intentionally restrained. I pointed out her procedural errors gently enough that the judge would deny her motions, but subtly enough that Britney would assume we were just playing standard procedural games. I wanted her to believe she was holding her own. I needed her arrogance to remain unchecked so that my father would not panic and hire a competent outside firm to replace her. I was giving her enough rope to hang the entire company, and she was eagerly wrapping it around her own neck. Then the discovery phase opened, which is the arena where cases are truly won or lost. I drafted a sweeping subpoena demanding all internal communications from Richard Afton's personal and corporate email accounts spanning a 3-year period. I cast a wide net expecting a fierce battle. A seasoned corporate defense lawyer would have immediately filed a protective order or claimed executive privilege to shield the chief executive from exposure. They would have forced us to fight for every single email in front of a magistrate judge. Britney did nothing. The 30-day deadline to object to the subpoena came and went in total silence. She either did not understand the severity of the request, or she simply forgot to mark the date on her calendar. 2 weeks later, a secure hard drive arrived at our office, containing my father's unvarnished digital history. I spent an entire weekend locked in my office reading through his correspondence. It was a digital diary of corporate greed and arrogance. He was not just passively benefiting from the misclassification of his truck drivers, he was the architect of the fraud. On a Saturday night at 2 a.m, I found the exact exchange I needed. It was an email thread between Richard and his lead dispatch manager. The manager had written a long message warning my father that drivers were exceeding the hours of service mandated by the Department of Transportation and complaining about stolen wages. My father replied 12 minutes later with a single chilling directive to fix the timestamps and keep the trucks moving. He told the manager that if anyone complained, he should fire them and find someone who wanted to work. I sat back in my chair and stared at the glowing text. It was the holy grail of labor litigation. It was direct documented proof of intentional fraud, wage theft, and retaliation. Because Britney had waived her right to file a protective order by missing the deadline, that email was now fully admissible in federal court. She had handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy her own client. I printed the email, slipped it into a clear plastic sleeve, and placed it at the very front of my trial binder. While I was building an unassailable legal trap in Chicago, the Afton family was celebrating their imaginary victories in Indiana. Aunt Susan continued to act as my unwitting informant, sending a steady stream of text messages designed to make me feel small. According to her reports, Richard was parading around his country club, acting like a conquering king. He bought rounds of expensive drinks for his golf buddies, bragging loudly about how his brilliant daughter was running circles around the big city lawyers. He told anyone who would listen that the lawsuit was falling apart. Britney fueled the delusion by continuing to post her daily videos, showing off her tailored suits and claiming she was about to secure a historic victory for family businesses. They were intoxicating themselves with their own arrogance. They had built a reality where they were untouchable, and they refused to look at the cracks forming in the walls. Victoria Caldwell decided it was time to test their confidence and authorized me to send a formal settlement offer to opposing counsel. We proposed resolving the matter for $5 million, which would have avoided a public trial and kept those internal emails out of the public record. It was a generous off-ramp and a lifeline thrown to a drowning company. Britney rejected the offer within 4 hours. She did not counter or ask for a meeting to discuss terms. She sent a snide brief email stating that Afton Freight would not be extorted by greedy union organizers and that they looked forward to crushing our claims at the upcoming summary judgment hearing. She signed it with her official corporate counsel title in a bold cursive font. They had no idea who was actually reading those arrogant rejections. My name remained conspicuously absent from the primary signature blocks since Victoria Caldwell signed all the major public filings. Britney and Richard never bothered to read the fine print at the bottom of the page. They were so blinded by their assumption of victory that they did not bother to research the legal team orchestrating their demise. They were marching straight into an ambush with their heads held high, and I was more than happy to let them keep walking until they hit the wire. The federal judge overseeing the docket eventually grew tired of the endless back-and-forth paperwork. He reviewed Britney's chaotic motions and my restrained, calculated responses, but instead of ruling on the filings immediately, he issued a direct judicial order. He mandated one final in-person settlement conference. The court wanted the chief executive, the corporate counsel, and the lead litigators to sit at the same mahogany table and look each other in the eye before he allowed the case to proceed to a public trial. He scheduled the conference to take place at our offices in downtown Chicago. The trap was now fully constructed, the bait was taken, and the structural integrity of their lies was about to be tested against the cold hard weight of federal evidence. But before they even stepped foot in the city, the true depth of their vulnerability was already resting in a manila folder on my desk. Because Britney had missed that critical 14-day window to file a protective order, she had accidentally granted our firm unrestricted legal access to Richard's corporate email servers. In the world of high-stakes litigation, this is equivalent to leaving the vault door wide open during a heist. A seasoned attorney would have fought for months to shield the private communications of the CEO. But Britney's negligence had turned my father's digital history into an open book. I spent 3 nights in my office, the only light coming from the dual monitors that illuminated the dark room, sifting through thousands of messages. I was looking for more than just mismanagement. I was looking for intent. Most corporate cases are built on negligence, which is expensive, but intentional fraud is what destroys a legacy. I searched for keywords related to payroll timestamps and driver logs. I found plenty of evidence of my father's arrogance, including several messages where he mocked the union as a group of ungrateful children, but I needed the smoking gun. I found it buried in a thread from late August sent at 2 a.m. It was an exchange between Richard and his lead dispatch manager. The manager had written a long, worried message warning my father that the drivers were exceeding the legal hours of service mandated by the Department of Transportation. He explicitly stated that the drivers were complaining about stolen wages and that the company was at risk of a major federal audit. He was practically begging for permission to fix the payroll records to reflect actual hours worked. My father's reply came 12 minutes later, and it was a masterpiece of self-incrimination. He told the manager to fix the timestamps, to match the budget, not the reality, and to keep the trucks moving. He wrote that if anyone complained, the manager should fire them immediately and find someone else who actually wanted to work. There it was, in stark black and white. It was documented proof of intentional fraud, wage theft, and retaliation. It was the holy grail of labor litigation, and because of Britney's incompetence, it was now fully admissible in a federal courtroom. I sat back in my chair, the silence of the Chicago skyline pressing against the windows, and felt a chilling sense of satisfaction. I remembered my father standing in Grandma Evelyn's kitchen telling me I was the strong one while he handed my future to a girl who couldn't even manage a calendar. He had bet everything on the wrong daughter, and his golden child had just handed me the sword I would use to execute his empire. I printed the email on heavy bond paper, slipped it into a clear plastic sleeve, and placed it at the very front of my trial binder. The irony was not lost on me. that the very arrogance my father used to run his business was the same trait that blinded him to the danger he was in. He genuinely believed that because he was Richard Afton, the rules did not apply to him. He thought he could bully his way through a federal lawsuit the same way he bullied his family at Thanksgiving dinner. He had no idea that he was no longer the most powerful person in the room. He was walking into a surgical theater and I was the one holding the scalpel. In the days leading up to the conference, Aunt Susan's messages reached a fever pitch of delusion. She sent me a link to a video Britney had posted showing her in a new designer suit, claiming she was preparing for a victory meeting in Chicago. She talked about how family businesses were the backbone of America and how she was proud to defend her father's honor. She was performing for an audience of digital strangers, completely unaware that her performance was about to end in a catastrophic crash. She was treating a federal labor dispute like a branding opportunity, while I was treating it like a war of annihilation. I spent my final preparation sessions with Victoria Caldwell. We sat in her office, the air thick with the smell of expensive espresso, as we went over the final strategy. Victoria looked at the August email and smiled, that sharp, predatory smile of hers. She told me that never in her 30 years of practice had she seen a defense attorney give away the case so completely. She asked me if I was ready to face them not as a daughter but as a litigator. I told her that 5 years ago my parents had made it clear that I was an outsider. I was simply returning the favor by treating them with the same clinical detachment they had shown me. The night before the conference, I sat on the dock of the lake house I had recently purchased with my first major bonus. The water was still reflecting the towering pines and the cold stars above. I thought about the girl who had sat on a porch in Indiana 5 years ago crying because her future had been stolen by a phone call. I wanted to tell her that the silence she had chosen was about to pay off in ways she couldn't yet imagine. I wasn't just going to win a lawsuit. I was going to dismantle the entire foundation of lies that had kept me small for 3 decades. The paper war was over and the digital smoking gun was loaded. It was time for the Afton family to walk through the frosted glass doors of Caldwell and Associates and finally meet the architect of their ruin. They were expecting a quick settlement and a return to their country club lifestyle, but I was preparing to hand them a bill that would bankrupt their souls. The wind was finally picking up, and the house of cards was starting to sway with a violence they wouldn't realize was fatal until the roof collapsed on their heads. My father thought he knew me, but he had no idea that the daughter he broke was about to become his worst nightmare in a room where his money couldn't save him. It was a Tuesday morning in late October, and the air rolling off Lake Michigan was sharp and biting, carrying the early promise of a brutal winter. Our primary conference room at Caldwell and Associates matched that exact temperature. The space was designed specifically to serve as a monument to corporate intimidation, featuring floor-to-ceiling windows that offered an unobstructed panoramic view of the gray churning water. A long, polished mahogany table stretched across the center of the floor, surrounded by heavy, high-backed leather chairs that forced anyone sitting in them to maintain a strict, rigid posture. There was no warmth in this room, and there were no comfortable corners. It was a chamber built for extracting surrenders, and today it was the stage for an ambush 5 years in the making. I was not sitting at the mahogany table when the meeting began. Instead, I was standing in the adjoining antechamber with the heavy oak door left open just a fraction of an inch. This was a tactical choice Victoria and I had agreed upon the night before, because she wanted them to settle into their unearned confidence before I made my entrance. I stood in the quiet shadows, holding a silver digital tablet that felt heavy with the weight of the evidence cued on its screen. I had every unredacted financial ledger, every canceled paycheck, and the damning late-night email where my father ordered his dispatch manager to falsify driver timestamps. My heart maintained a slow, steady rhythm. 5 years ago, standing in the proximity of my family would have sent my nervous system into a frantic spiral, but the woman standing in that room today was no longer a frightened student. The trauma they inflicted had burned away long ago, leaving behind a litigator forged in high-stakes combat. At exactly 10 o'clock, the heavy frosted glass doors of the main executive suite swung open. The sound of high heels clicking against the hardwood floor and the heavy thud of expensive dress shoes echoed down the hallway as our firm receptionist escorted the Afton family toward the conference room. My father walked in first, wearing a custom-tailored navy pinstripe suit that projected wealth and authority. His chest was puffed out, and his chin was raised in that familiar posture of unearned dominance as he surveyed the opulent room. He was trying to mask his underlying intimidation with a look of bored disdain, as if he were merely humoring a minor inconvenience. My mother, Linda, trailed closely behind him, carrying a pristine designer handbag, resting carefully on her forearm like a shield. She wore a tight, polite smile, looking at the original artwork on the walls, as if she were inspecting a hotel she might consider purchasing. She had zero business being present at a federal settlement conference, but Richard had brought her along for the spectacle so she could witness their golden child defeat the big city lawyers. Then came Britney. She was dressed like a caricature of a ruthless television attorney in a bright crimson blazer and tailored trousers with towering heels. She strutted past our receptionist and walked directly to the opposite end of the mahogany table. She did not set her leather briefcase down gently. She slammed it onto the polished wood so that the sharp crack echoed loudly through the room. It was a deeply theatrical gesture, something she had likely practiced in front of a bedroom mirror. She was playing a role, and she desperately wanted the room to feel her presence. Victoria Caldwell sat alone at the head of the table, wearing a simple charcoal gray suit. She did not stand to greet them, and she did not offer a hand for a greeting. She simply took a slow, measured sip from her porcelain coffee cup, her dark eyes tracking their movements with predatory stillness. Richard did not sit down immediately. He remained standing, leaning forward to place both hands flat on the table to command the physical space. He looked down at Victoria with a tight, condescending smirk and barked that they should make this quick because he was a very busy man. He claimed he had driven 3 hours from Indiana only because a federal judge forced him to attend, and that he had a company to run. Victoria set her coffee cup down and steepled her fingers together, resting them under her chin while she waited. Silence is a formidable weapon in a negotiation, and Victoria wielded it masterfully, forcing the opposing party to keep talking to fill the uncomfortable void. Richard took the bait, shifting his weight and raising his voice slightly, as he stated that his daughter had prepared a summary judgment motion that would have the entire frivolous lawsuit thrown out by Friday. He claimed we had zero admissible evidence and accused us of trying to extort a hard-working family business on behalf of lazy union organizers. Britney nodded eagerly, stepping forward to open her briefcase and slide a thin stack of printed documents across the table toward Victoria. She announced that those were copies of their final pleadings and suggested we drop the suit today to save ourselves the embarrassment of a public dismissal on the federal record. Listening to them speak from the shadows, I felt a brief flash of genuine astonishment at their breathtaking ignorance. They were sitting inside a legal fortress that had bankrupted multinational corporations, and they were acting like they held a winning lottery ticket. They did not understand that the documents Britney just slid across the table were legally worthless because she had missed every critical filing deadline. Victoria looked down at the papers but did not pick them up. She tilted her head slightly, studying Britney the way a scientist might study a fascinating but ultimately harmless insect. Then she shifted her gaze back to Richard, and the cold indifference in her eyes made my father's arrogant smirk falter for a fraction of a second. Victoria stated that his confidence was noted, but then she delivered the first blow. She explained that she was not the lead litigator assigned to this matter and was simply observing the proceedings. She said the attorney managing their ruin was ready to present our terms. Richard frowned deeply and demanded to know who was managing the case. Victoria reached out her hand and pressed the silver intercom button on her desk. The small speaker emitted a soft electronic chime that cut through the tension in the room. "Emilia," she said, her voice carrying clearly into the adjoining room, "we are ready for you." The sound of my name spoken in that room caused a sudden profound shift in the atmosphere. Through the crack in the door, I watched the physical reaction ripple through my family. My father froze, his hands still pressed flat against the mahogany wood, as his brain struggled to process the familiar name in this foreign, hostile environment. I saw my mother grip her designer handbag a little tighter, her eyes darting nervously toward the closed door. Britney stopped shuffling her papers, her theatrical posture stiffening into a rigid mask of confusion. I stood in the quiet shadows for one more second, ensuring the evidence was perfectly cued on my tablet. I smoothed the lapels of my navy blazer, took one final deep breath, and stepped forward. I turned the brass handle and pushed the heavy oak door open. The hinges were perfectly silent, but the sudden shift in the air current caused everyone at the mahogany table to look up at once. I stepped over the threshold and let the door click firmly shut behind me. The silence that instantly fell over the conference room was a vacuum of sound and breath. I watched my mother first, who was holding her porcelain coffee cup halfway to her mouth. Her jaw physically dropped and her lips parted in profound shock as the cup hovered frozen in midair. My father was leaning forward, and I watched the blood rapidly drain from his cheeks, replacing his ruddy country club complexion with a sickly pale gray. His arrogant posture evaporated instantly, wiped away by sheer uncomprehending terror. And then there was Britney. She stared at me, her eyes darting frantically from my tailored suit to the silver tablet in my hand and then over to Victoria Caldwell. I could practically see the gears grinding in her head as she tried to reconcile the unstable dropout sister she had mocked for 5 years with the polished corporate executive standing confidently in the plaintiff counsel position. I did not gloat or glare. I walked with measured, even steps toward the empty chair directly across from my father. I pulled it back, the leather scraping softly against the carpet, and sat down. I placed my tablet flat on the table and folded my hands over it. "Good morning," I said, my voice clinical and entirely devoid of any familial warmth. I told them my name was Emilia Afton, lead litigator for the plaintiffs, and that I would be handling the negotiations on behalf of the union today. Richard blinked rapidly, looking at me as if I were a ghost, before snapping his head toward Victoria to ask what kind of joke this was. He stammered that I was not a lawyer and that I had failed my exam 5 years ago after a mental breakdown. Victoria did not flinch as she looked back at my father with eyes like black ice. She assured him that Caldwell and Associates does not employ unstable dropouts to manage $8 million federal dockets and suggested he sit down and listen to his opposing counsel. The ambush was complete, and the room belonged to me. I did not gloat, and I did not raise my voice to defend myself against my father's desperate accusations. I did not demand an apology for the smear campaign that had isolated me for half a decade or the career they tried to bury. Facts do not require volume. I simply opened my leather portfolio and pulled out 2 thick pieces of premium cardstock. They were certified copies bearing the raised gold seals of the state Supreme Courts. I slid them slowly across the polished mahogany. They glided over the wood and came to a halt precisely 1 inch from my father's trembling hands. "Those are my licenses to practice law in Illinois and Indiana," I stated calmly. "I took the uniform exam 5 years ago, the exact same cycle Britney failed for the second time. I passed on my first attempt and scored in the top 2% of the nation. I have been a practicing corporate litigator for half a decade, while you were busy telling your golf buddies I was a broken failure." Richard stared down at the gold seals, and his breathing became shallow and erratic. The 5-year lie and the intricate false narrative he built to protect his pride was crumbling right in front of his eyes. Linda finally lowered her coffee cup, her hands shaking so badly the ceramic rattled loudly against the saucer. "But we are not here today to discuss my resume," I continued, shifting my posture forward and tapping the screen of my tablet to wake it up. "We are here to discuss the $8 million you owe my clients for systemic wage theft and intentional labor misclassification." Britney finally found her voice, but it was thin and shrill, completely stripped of the confident persona she performed in her daily internet videos. "You do not have a case, Emilia," she snapped, trying to sound authoritative, but failing miserably as her voice trembled. "We filed our motions to dismiss, and we are going to walk away because you have zero proof of any intentional fraud. I turned my gaze to my younger sister. I looked at her with the cold, clinical pity of a veteran attorney observing a catastrophic amateur. The illusion she projected was so incredibly fragile. "You do not have a defense, Britney," I replied, my tone dangerously quiet. "You missed the procedural deadline to file a protective order regarding the plaintiff discovery requests. By failing to invoke executive privilege on those documents, you handed us unrestricted legal access to the corporate servers. We have every single internal communication from the last 3 years." Britney swallowed hard, the color draining from her own face now. I tapped the screen of my tablet, sending a digital command to the large flat-screen monitor mounted on the conference room wall. The screen flickered to life, displaying Exhibit A in stark, high definition. It was the late-night email thread between Richard and his dispatch manager. The text was magnified so the entire room could read it clearly. I gestured toward the screen. "In this email dated August 14th, your dispatch manager warns you about federal hours of service violations. 12 minutes later, you explicitly order him to falsify the driver timestamps and fire anyone who complains. That is direct documented proof of federal fraud." I watched my father's eyes travel up to the monitor. He recognized his own words and the specific phrasing he used. The realization hit him like a runaway freight train crashing through the glass windows. He was not just losing a civil lawsuit. He was looking at severe personal liability. He turned his head slowly and looked at his golden child. Britney was shrinking down into her heavy leather chair, tears welling up in her eyes, unable to formulate a single legal objection. Richard finally saw her for exactly what she was. She was not a prodigy. She was a manufactured success story who had just handed the opposing counsel the exact weapon needed to destroy his entire legacy. "But that is not even the most catastrophic error you made." I continued, pulling a second document from my leather portfolio. I slid it across the mahogany table. It was a standard legal form, a formal request for admissions. 30 days ago, we sent you 42 specific requests asking you to either admit or deny the allegations of wage theft. According to Rule 36, if a party fails to respond to a request for admission within 30 days, the matters are legally deemed admitted. I paused, letting the silence stretch out, allowing the crushing gravity of the law to settle over the room. "You never responded," I stated. "Therefore, as of yesterday morning, you have legally admitted to all 42 counts of intentional wage theft on behalf of Afton Freight. You have confessed to the entire lawsuit without ever stepping foot inside a courtroom." My mother let out a small, horrified gasp. She pressed her hand over her mouth, staring at Britney in absolute disbelief. Richard Afton sat completely paralyzed. His chest stopped heaving, and the aggressive corporate executive persona he had worn for decades was gone. For the next 15 minutes, I systematically dismantled the remaining fragments of their defense. I turned the conference room into a surgical theater, and I dissected every single legal filing my sister had ever submitted. I did not do it with anger. I did it with the clinical detachment of a professional doing her job. I brought up her motions to dismiss, pointing out that she had cited case law that the Supreme Court had explicitly overturned years prior. I explained how her failure to redact the financial ledgers properly had given us the exact profit margins Afton Freight had hidden from the Internal Revenue Service. I walked them through her vendor contracts, demonstrating how she had waived corporate protections and exposed the company to endless third-party liability. I detailed the reckless indemnity clauses she had signed without reading, binding the business to toxic debt. I listed the missed deadlines, the improper formatting, and the blatant disregard for basic judicial procedure. I did not rush through the list. I took my time. I presented each failure with the corresponding document, sliding the physical proof across the table so they could see the sheer magnitude of the disaster. My mother was practically hyperventilating. She clutched her designer bag against her chest like a life preserver. She had spent 5 years playing the role of the proud mother of a legal prodigy. Now she was trapped in a room listening to a comprehensive inventory of her favorite daughter's total professional incompetence. With every sentence I spoke, Brittany's posture collapsed a little more. She shrank into the expensive leather chair, trying to disappear. Her face was flushed bright red, and thick tears ruined the flawless aesthetic she presented to her internet followers. She opened her mouth several times, trying to find a loophole, but the words died in her throat. She had no script for this, and there were no social media filters to hide her profound incompetence. She was a fraud, exposed in the harshest light possible. Then I delivered the final fatal blow. I turned my attention away from the golden child and focused entirely on the man who had funded her delusions. "Mr. Afton," I said, lowering my voice to ensure he heard every single syllable. "The corporate veil exists to protect business owners from personal liability. It is the only thing standing between your business debts and your personal bank accounts. But because your counsel failed to file the basic protective motions, and because we have written proof that you personally directed the dispatch managers to commit fraud, the union is no longer just suing Afton Freight. We are piercing the corporate veil." Richard swallowed hard, his eyes wide with a terrifying comprehension. "What does that mean?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "It means you are personally liable for the $8 million judgment," I explained. "When the company bank accounts are drained, we will file liens against your personal assets. We will seize your investment portfolios. We will take the luxury vehicles. We will liquidate the retirement funds you built over 40 years, and we will foreclose on the house in Indiana. You are not just going to lose your logistics company today. You are going to lose absolutely everything you own because you hired an incompetent lawyer." The room went completely still. The only sound was the faint hum of the climate control system and the muffled sound of Brittany's quiet sobbing. Richard Afton turned his head slowly. He looked at the daughter sitting next to him and the expensive designer suit he had purchased for her. He looked at the leather briefcase resting on the table, a prop in a play she was never qualified to star in. For 5 years, he had poured his fortune and his pride into maintaining her illusion. He had sacrificed his relationship with me and lied to everyone he knew just to prove he was right about her. And now, sitting in a Chicago high-rise, he finally saw the truth he had been running from. The illusion was dead. He saw Britney for exactly what she was. She was a manufactured product of his own arrogance, a woman utterly incapable of defending him when the real world demanded competence. Then my father turned his head and looked across the table at me. He saw the tailored navy suit and the gold seals on my state licenses. He saw the calm, unwavering focus in my eyes and the massive stack of irrefutable evidence I had compiled against him. For the first time in my entire life, Richard Afton actually saw me. He saw the intellect he had ignored and the relentless work ethic he had dismissed. I was the daughter he banished to the cold, hoping I would fail. Instead, I had built an empire in the shadows, and now I was the one holding the gavel. I watched the realization break him. His shoulders slumped forward and the rigid structure of his jaw relaxed into a look of defeated exhaustion. He had spent his life betting on the wrong child, and the bill had finally come due. Richard walked back into the conference room with the heavy, dragging footsteps of a man walking to his own execution. He did not look at my mother, who was still clutching her designer handbag like a life preserver. He did not look at Britney, who sat paralyzed in her chair, her face streaked with ruined makeup. He walked directly to the mahogany table, pulled his chair out, and sat down. The silence in the room was absolute. It was the sound of an empire collapsing. He reached out and picked up the heavy silver fountain pen resting beside the settlement documents. His hand was shaking so violently he had to press his other palm flat against the wood just to steady his wrist. I watched the metal nib touch the thick paper. I listened to the sharp scratching sound as he signed his name on the dotted line, binding himself to an $8 million judgment. He initialed the annexes, conceding to the liquidation of his corporate assets and the forfeiture of his personal accounts to cover the stolen wages. When he finished the final signature, he dropped the pen. It clattered against the table, rolling to a stop near my digital tablet. Victoria Caldwell reached across the table and pulled the executed contract toward her. She inspected the signatures with a clinical eye, ensuring every line was properly endorsed. She nodded once, signaling the end of the war. "You will receive the escrow instructions by tomorrow morning, Mr. Afton," she stated, her voice devoid of any triumph or pity. "I suggest you retain competent bankruptcy counsel immediately. We are adjourned." My father stood up. He looked at me one last time. There was no anger left in his eyes, only a hollow, devastating emptiness. He turned and walked out of the frosted glass doors. My mother followed him, her head bowed, her posture shattered. Britney was the last to leave. She gathered her useless motions, shoved them into her expensive briefcase, and practically ran out of the room, desperate to escape the suffocating reality of her own failure. I did not celebrate their departure. I did not pump my fists or organize a victory dinner with my junior associates. I simply gathered my legal pads, closed my portfolio, and walked back to my office. I handed the signed agreement to my paralegal, instructed her to file it with the federal clerk, and moved on to my next case. The fallout occurred with breathtaking speed. The justice system moves slowly until it suddenly does not. Within 30 days, Afton Freight officially filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection, but the debts were too staggering to reorganize. A federal judge swiftly converted the filing to a Chapter 7 liquidation. The entire shipping fleet was seized. The warehouse properties were auctioned off to rival logistics firms at a fraction of their value. When the corporate assets fell short of the $8 million judgment, the collection agencies turned their attention to my father's personal wealth. The bank foreclosed on the sprawling Birchwood estate. His luxury vehicles were repossessed from the driveway in broad daylight while the neighbors watched from their front lawns. The country club revoked his membership due to unpaid dues, permanently erasing his social standing. The narrative he had spent his life protecting disintegrated overnight. Britney faced an even harsher reality. The State Bar Association opened a formal disciplinary investigation into her conduct. The union lawyers submitted the transcript of our settlement conference detailing her catastrophic failure to invoke executive privilege and her admission to 42 counts of corporate fraud. She was formally charged with gross negligence and malpractice. She was quietly fired from her corporate counsel role the day the company went under. She deleted all her social media accounts, erasing the boss babe persona she had curated for years. The golden child who was handed the world on a silver platter managed to drop it and shatter it into a million pieces. 3 weeks after the settlement hit the regional news cycle, my phone rang. I was sitting in my kitchen holding a mug of tea, watching the morning light filter through the window. The caller identification displayed a familiar Indiana area code. I answered the call. "Hello, Grandma," I said. A warm, raspy laugh echoed through the speaker. "I always knew you were the smart one, Emilia," Evelyn said, her voice rich with an undeniable satisfaction. I smiled, leaning against the granite counter. "It was not a difficult case, Grandma. They handed me the evidence. They were arrogant. They were foolish." Evelyn corrected her tone, sharpening just a fraction. "But you know, sweetheart, the universe needs a little push sometimes to make sure foolish people face the right consequences." I frowned slightly, setting my mug down. "What do you mean?" There was a brief pause on the line, filled only by the sound of static. "You know the lead driver for the union?" Evelyn said slowly. "The gentleman who organized the lawsuit. He attends my Methodist church. A few months ago, after Sunday service, he was standing in the vestibule complaining about how they needed a ruthless, big city lawyer to fight your father. He said the local attorneys were too intimidated by the Afton name." My heart skipped a beat. A slow, creeping realization washed over me. "Grandma, what did you do?" "I simply wrote Victoria Caldwell's name and Chicago address on a piece of church bulletin paper," Evelyn replied, her voice perfectly innocent. "I handed it to him and told him to make a phone call. I told him he would find exactly what he was looking for." I stood frozen in my kitchen. The intersection of fate was not an accident. The universe did not deliver karma on a silver platter. My grandmother, the woman who bought my first study books, the woman they used as a pawn to ruin my exam day, had orchestrated the entire collision. She had aimed the weapon directly at them, knowing I would be the one waiting on the other side. "I love you, Grandma," I whispered, my vision blurring with sudden unshed tears. "I love you too, my fierce girl," she answered softly. "Now go live your beautiful life." And that is exactly what I did. I spend my weekends now far away from the corporate battlegrounds of the city. I bought a quiet piece of property, a small lake house surrounded by towering pine trees. I spend my mornings sitting on the wooden dock watching the water ripple against the shore. I am not alone. I share this peace with my husband Mark. He is an architect, a quiet, steady man who builds things instead of tearing them down. He knows everything about my past, and he has never once looked at me as if I am broken. We fill the lake house with our chosen family colleagues who supported me during the grueling associate years, friends who brought me groceries when I was studying, and mentors who demanded excellence instead of obedience. I learned the hardest lesson a daughter can ever learn. Blood does not make a family. Consistency makes a family. Loyalty makes a family. Showing up when the room is dark and the odds are terrible makes a family. I did not seek revenge on my parents. Revenge requires you to carry the poison of the people who hurt you. I did not actively plot to destroy their logistics company or sabotage my sister's career. I just built my life in silence. I mastered my craft. I became undeniably excellent at what I do. I simply let their own lies catch up to them, and I made sure I was the one holding the pen when the ultimate bill came due. If you are the scapegoat in your family right now, I know exactly how heavy that burden feels. I know the suffocating isolation of watching people you love twist reality to protect someone else. Stop waiting for them to see your worth. They are committed to misunderstanding you because seeing your light would expose their darkness. Stop arguing with their false narratives. Take your energy and build your life in silence. Educate yourself. Secure your financial independence. Become an undeniable force in whatever arena you choose. And when they finally come knocking desperate for the resources they assume you owe them, let them find a door that you entirely control. You do not have to open it. Thank you for listening to my story. If you stand by your boundaries and refuse to let toxic people define your future, please drop a heart in the comments below. I read every single one. And if you want to hear more stories about survival and reclaiming your power, hit that subscribe button. Remember, you own the pen that writes your future. I will see you in the next one. The morning sun now glints off the surface of the lake, a view I bought with the currency of my own resilience rather than my father's permission. Standing here, the weight of the last 5 years has finally settled into something useful. Not a burden, but a foundation. My parents and Britney are gone from my daily life, living in the wreckage of a house of cards they insisted on building with lies and borrowed pride. They tried to bury me, but they forgot I was the only one who actually knew how to dig. Watching their empire collapse wasn't the victory I expected. It wasn't loud or explosive. It was a quiet, clinical liquidation of everything they valued. I didn't have to throw a single punch because their own incompetence did the work for me. In the end, the truth didn't need to be shouted. It just needed the right legal forum and a daughter who refused to be a victim. Reflecting on this journey, I've distilled 5 hard-won lessons for anyone currently trapped in a narrative they didn't write. Silence is a strategic incubator. When you stop trying to convince toxic people of your worth, you reclaim the energy needed to build your own empire. Competence is the ultimate weapon. In a world of social media filters and manufactured success, genuine skill and clinical precision are undeniable and lethal. Family is defined by consistency, not biology. Blood may provide a connection, but only loyalty, and showing up when the room is dark create a true family. Never interrupt an arrogant person making a mistake. If your enemies are busy digging their own graves through negligence, step back and hand them a larger shovel. You own the pen. No matter how many chapters others try to write for you, you are the only one who can sign the final judgment on your life. I am no longer the girl who ran through an airport sobbing for a grandmother who wasn't sick. I am the woman who stood in a mahogany boardroom and watched the golden child realize that a designer briefcase is a useless prop if you don't know the law. I've traded their conditional approval for a life that is entirely beautifully mine. If you are the scapegoat, the one they call unstable, simply because you are strong enough to survive their chaos, know that your time is coming. Build in the shadows, master your craft, and let your success be the only noise you make. Thank you for walking through this fire with me. If you've survived a family that tried to dim your light, please drop a heart in the comments below. I read every single one of them. For more stories about reclaiming your power and watching the truth prevail, make sure to hit that subscribe button here at Hazel Tells Stories. Remember, the bill always comes due, and you want to be the one holding the pen when it does.